After 30 years of distinguished service in the Air Force, Jack Hunter, a retired colonel, finally returned home with dreams of a peaceful retirement. The military life had been grueling, and Jack was ready to embrace the tranquility of civilian life with his wife, Alice. As his plane descended into their small hometown, Jack couldn't help but smile, imagining the life of leisure that awaited him: fishing trips, tending to his garden, and most importantly, reconnecting with Alice after decades of separation and fleeting reunions during his deployments. Upon arrival, the initial warmth of homecoming was comforting. Alice welcomed Jack with a smile and a quiet dinner at their home, a modest yet elegant house she had maintained impeccably during his years away. Jack noticed small changes. The garden had bloomed beautifully under Alice's care, and the house bore a modern touch he wasn't used to. Despite these changes, the essence of home remained intact. But as the days turned into weeks, Jack started noticing peculiarities. Alice seemed distant at times, her attention often diverted to her phone or long errands. Their conversations lacked the warmth he remembered, and there was a lingering tension he couldn't quite place. At first, Jack attributed it to the adjustment period. After all, they were reacquainting themselves after 3 decades of a long-distance relationship. But the feeling persisted. One morning, as Jack rummaged through a drawer in search of a flashlight, he stumbled upon an envelope labeled financial statements. Intrigued, he opened it and found documents that made his heart sink. They detailed substantial withdrawals from their savings account over the past 2 years. Jack confronted Alice that evening. She dismissed his concerns, claiming the money had been spent on home renovations and unexpected medical bills. Her explanations were plausible, but something about her tone felt rehearsed. Determined to uncover the truth, Jack began to pay closer attention. He noticed Alice often left the house in the late afternoons, dressed more elegantly than usual. When he casually asked about her outings, she claimed she was attending book club meetings or visiting friends. Jack decided to follow her one day, feeling a pang of guilt but driven by the gnawing suspicion that something was amiss. What he discovered shattered his world. Alice had driven to a cozy cafe on the outskirts of town. Through the window, Jack saw her laughing and holding hands with a man he didn't recognize. The intimacy between them was undeniable. Jack's chest tightened as he watched them share a kiss, a sight that confirmed his worst fears. That night, Jack confronted Alice with what he had seen. Initially, she denied it, but when faced with his unwavering gaze and detailed account, she broke down. She admitted to the affair, explaining that loneliness had consumed her during Jack's long absences. The man, Ethan, was someone she had met through a local community group. He had been a source of comfort and companionship in Jack's absence, she said. Jack was devastated but tried to understand. He had always known the sacrifices Alice had made as a military spouse, but he had never imagined it would lead to this. The betrayal stung deeply, but so did the realization that his career had come at the cost of their bond. In the days that followed, Jack grappled with a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sorrow, and a profound sense of loss. The home he had yearned to return to now felt alien. Alice tried to make amends, cutting off contact with Ethan and seeking counseling, but the chasm between them seemed insurmountable. To cope, Jack threw himself into restoring an old boat he had purchased years ago but never had the time to repair. The solitude of the task provided a semblance of peace, but the silence at home was deafening. Conversations with Alice were stilted, their interactions filled with an unspoken tension. As weeks turned into months, Jack realized he was at a crossroads. Forgiveness was a path he could choose, but it required a strength he wasn't sure he had. Rebuilding trust felt like an impossible task, yet the thought of abandoning the life they had built together weighed heavily on him. For Alice, the regret was palpable, but so was her uncertainty about whether they could ever truly reconcile. Jack often found himself staring at the horizon, the vastness of the sea mirroring the uncertainty of his future. He had spent his life leading men in battle, making split-second decisions in the face of danger. But now, faced with the most personal battle of his life, Jack felt adrift, unsure of which course to chart. When I found out about Alice's affair with Victor, it wasn't like a bolt of lightning. It was slow, insidious, creeping up on me with every inconsistency, every strange look, every small lie that didn't quite add up. At first, I thought my suspicions were just the product of a restless mind. After all, I had spent decades leading a structured life, where every challenge had a solution, every problem a protocol. But now, at home, there were no orders to follow, no manual for uncovering what I didn't want to believe was true. Alice, my wife of nearly 35 years, the woman who had endured my absence through years of service, was a high school principal. She was respected in the community, a pillar of trust and discipline. That's why it felt impossible, almost absurd, to question her integrity. And yet, as I stood outside her office one afternoon, the truth stared me down with unflinching clarity. It began with a simple, almost innocent discovery. I had gone to surprise Alice at work, something I'd rarely done before. She was in a meeting, so I waited in her office. On her desk sat an open folder with neatly printed schedules, reminders, and memos. Among them was a note scribbled in the margins of a calendar page. It read, "Lunch with V, 1 p.m. Victor." I knew the name. He was the athletic coach. Alice had mentioned him a few times in passing, mostly in the context of school events or staff meetings. Nothing about those mentions had ever raised a red flag, but now that single letter, V, felt like a loaded secret. I brushed it off at first. Colleagues have lunch. It wasn't unusual. But the pit in my stomach didn't subside. That evening, I asked Alice how her day had gone. She answered smoothly, talking about a board meeting and some disciplinary issue with a student. She didn't mention lunch at all. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was a thread, and I couldn't resist pulling at it. The next day, I drove to the school again, parking far enough away to avoid being noticed. I told myself it was ridiculous, that I was acting like a paranoid fool. But when I saw Alice leaving with Victor, their laughter echoing in the air as they walked to his car, my heart sank. It wasn't just the way they talked, it was how close they stood, the easy familiarity between them, as if they were the only two people in the world. I followed them, careful to stay out of sight. They drove to a secluded diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where people go when they don't want to be seen. Watching them through the window, I felt like I was floating outside my body. They weren't overtly affectionate, but the way Victor leaned in, the way Alice smiled, it was all too much. This wasn't just a friendly lunch. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I dug deeper. I looked at our phone bill, combed through the call logs, and saw his number repeatedly. Texts, late-night calls, far too frequent to be professional. The messages I managed to glimpse when her phone was unattended were careful, vague. "Thinking of you. Can't wait. Miss you already." They didn't need to be explicit to confirm what I feared. It wasn't just lunch. It wasn't just texts. It wasn't just now. This had been going on for years. Decades. 20 years, to be exact. I pieced it together from emails, old photos, and other scraps of evidence I wished I hadn't found. Their affair began while I was deployed overseas, when I was writing letters to Alice about how much I missed her, how much I was counting the days until I could come home. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, as if someone had reached inside me and torn out something vital. I replayed every moment of our marriage, searching for signs I might have missed, for moments when I could have done something differently. Had I been too distant? Too focused on my career? But no matter how much blame I tried to shoulder, it always came back to one inescapable fact. Alice had made this choice. Repeatedly. For 20 years. When I finally confronted her, it wasn't with shouting or anger. It was quiet. Devastating. I sat her down in the living room, placed the printed texts and emails in front of her, and asked her to explain. At first, she denied it. Then, when the evidence became undeniable, she broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted to everything. She tried to justify it, saying she had been lonely, that she never stopped loving me but had found comfort in Victor's arms during my long absences. "I needed someone, Jack," she said, her voice cracking. "I never meant to hurt you." Never meant to hurt me? How could she not see that every day of those 20 years was a betrayal? Every stolen moment with Victor was a slap in the face to the life we had built, to the sacrifices I had made for our family. I asked her why she didn't leave, why she didn't tell me the truth. She said she didn't want to destroy our family, that she hoped I would never find out. "I didn't want to lose you," she said, as if that made it any better. Victor. His name hung in the air like a curse. I wanted to find him, to confront him, to make him pay for what he had taken from me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about him. This was about us, about the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. Alice begged for forgiveness, for a chance to make things right. But how could I ever look at her the same way? How could I share a home, a bed, a life with someone who had betrayed me so completely? The questions swirled in my mind, each one heavier than the last, as I sat in the silence of our once happy home, wondering if anything could ever be whole again. The night I told Alice it was over felt like the longest night of my life. After the confrontation, after the damning evidence had been laid bare and her tears had come and gone, I sat there in the living room, staring at her as she tried to gather herself. She looked so small, so defeated, and for a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But pity wasn't enough to erase what she'd done. It wasn't enough to make me forget that for 20 years, Alice had lied to me, deceived me, and betrayed everything we had built together. She had turned our marriage into a sham, and there was no coming back from that. "Alice," I said finally, breaking the silence, "this isn't just about us anymore. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed our family. Our children. They deserve to know the truth." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. Please, don't bring them into this. They don't need to know." "Yes, they do," I said, my voice firm. "They're adults now. They can handle it. And they have a right to know what's been going on behind their backs all these years." Alice tried to argue, tried to plead with me to keep it between us, but I was resolute. This wasn't just about justice, it was about honesty. For too long, she had hidden behind lies, and I wasn't going to let her keep hiding. Not anymore. The next evening, I called our children, Daniel and Sarah, and asked them to come over. I told them it was important, that it was something we needed to discuss as a family. They arrived a few hours later, their faces filled with concern. They were close to Alice, especially Sarah, and I knew this was going to shatter them. We sat in the living room, the same room where Alice had confessed everything to me just days before. The air was heavy, charged with the tension of what was about to unfold. I looked at Alice, giving her the chance to start, but she sat frozen, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Dad, what's going on?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowed. I took a deep breath. "Your mother has something to tell you." Alice's head snapped up, her eyes pleading with me. But there was no way out. Not this time. After a long moment, she began to speak, her voice trembling as she told them about the affair. She left out the details, but it was enough to make Sarah gasp in shock and Daniel clench his fists. "Why, Mom?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this to Dad? To us?" Alice tried to explain, falling back on the same excuses she had given me, loneliness, feeling abandoned during my deployments, but it only made things worse. The kids weren't buying it. They looked at her as if she were a stranger, someone they didn't recognize. The hardest part was watching the pain in their eyes, the way their image of their mother crumbled right in front of them. Sarah stormed out of the room, unable to handle it, and Daniel just sat there, his jaw clenched tight, refusing to look at her. After the kids left, Alice broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. But I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no pity. Just a cold, hollow sense of finality. This was the end of us, and there was no point pretending otherwise. The next day, I called a lawyer and filed for divorce. Fortunately, we had a prenuptial agreement in place, a relic of my Air Force days, when I had been advised to protect my assets in case things didn't work out. At the time, I had thought it was unnecessary, even insulting to the love we shared. But now, it felt like a lifeline. Alice didn't fight me on the divorce. She knew she had no ground to stand on, no defense for what she had done. The prenup ensured that my savings, my pension, and the house would remain mine. She was entitled to some alimony, but nothing that would cripple me financially. It was a small consolation in the midst of so much pain. But the hardest part wasn't the legal proceedings, it was the fallout with her parents. They had always adored me, treated me like the son they never had. When I called them to explain what was happening, I could hear the heartbreak in their voices. They didn't defend Alice. In fact, they were furious with her. "How could she do this to you?" her mother said, her voice trembling with anger. "To the family?" "Jack, I don't know what to say." "There's nothing to say," I replied. "I just thought you should know." They insisted on coming over that evening to confront her themselves. Watching Alice face her parents was a strange, almost surreal experience. Her father, usually a calm and composed man, was visibly shaking with rage. "You had everything," he said to her. "A loyal husband, a beautiful family, a good life. And you threw it all away. For what?" Alice couldn't answer. She just sat there, silent and ashamed, as her parents tore into her. It was brutal, but I didn't feel sorry for her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and tense conversations. Alice moved out of the house and into a small apartment across town. I began the slow, painful process of rebuilding my life, one day at a time. Daniel and Sarah struggled with the news, especially Sarah. She barely spoke to her mother, and when she did, it was strained and cold. Daniel tried to be the peacemaker, but even he couldn't hide his disappointment. As for me, I found solace in small things: working on my boat, spending time with friends, reconnecting with old hobbies I had neglected for years. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. Every day felt a little less heavy, a little more bearable. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Standing in the courtroom, listening to the judge declare our marriage dissolved, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. It was the end of a chapter one had never imagined would close this way, but it was also the beginning of something new. As I walked out of the courthouse, I took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. The weight of Alice's betrayal was still there, but it no longer defined me. I was free to start over, to find happiness on my own terms. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could. It wasn't long after the divorce was finalized that I met Charlotte. I wasn't looking for anyone. To be honest, I wasn't even sure I was capable of opening my heart again. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. It happened by chance. I was sitting in a quiet cafe near the marina, nursing a cup of black coffee while scribbling notes in a leather-bound journal I'd started keeping. Writing had become a sort of therapy for me, a way to untangle the mess of emotions that still lingered from everything with Alice. The cafe was one of my favorite spots, tucked away, peaceful, with a view of the boats bobbing gently in the harbor. It was a place where I could think. That day, I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice the woman at the next table until she spoke. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of hesitation and warmth. "You wouldn't happen to have a spare pen, would you?" I looked up, startled. She was striking, but not in an ostentatious way, more like someone whose beauty was understated, revealed in layers the longer you looked. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her green eyes had a quiet depth that seemed to hold secrets of their own. She was holding a sketch pad, the kind artists used, and her hands were ink-stained, betraying hours of creative work. "Sure," I said, fumbling in my bag. I handed her a pen, and she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that felt like a warm breeze cutting through the chill of my thoughts. "Thanks," she said, and then, noticing my notebook, added, "Journaling?" "Something like that," I replied, closing the cover self-consciously. "And you?" "Sketching? Designing," she said. "I'm a freelance graphic designer. I come here to work sometimes when the walls of my apartment start to feel like they're closing in." We exchanged a few more words, light, easy conversation that felt natural despite the fact that we were strangers. Her name was Charlotte, and as we talked, I learned that she wasn't just a graphic designer, she was also Victor's estranged wife. That revelation came later in the conversation, almost casually, when I mentioned my ex-wife's affair. She stiffened slightly, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup, and then she sighed. "Victor," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "My ex-husband." For a moment, we both just stared at each other, the weight of that shared connection settling between us like an unspoken pact. She laughed softly, but it was a laugh without humor. "Small world, isn't it?" Too small, I replied, shaking my head. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Likewise, she said, her expression softening. It's not something you ever think will happen to you, is it? No, I said quietly. You don't. We spent the next few hours talking, and for the first time in a long while, I felt understood. Charlotte had been through her own version of hell with Victor, enduring years of emotional distance and unspoken suspicions before finally discovering his infidelity. She told me about the moment she found out, how it had shattered her world, and I shared my own story in turn. It was strange, comforting even, to speak openly with someone who truly understood the depth of the betrayal. We weren't just sharing stories, we were sharing wounds, stitching them together with every word. After that day, Charlotte and I started seeing each other more often. It wasn't planned, it just happened. We'd run into each other at the cafe, or she'd stop by the marina where I worked on my boat. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. She had a sharp wit and a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard in the best way, and she wasn't afraid to call me out when I started wallowing in self-pity. Jack, she said one afternoon, leaning against the railing of the marina as we watched the sunset. You've been through hell, but you're not a victim. Don't let this define you. Her words stuck with me. She wasn't just someone to commiserate with, she was someone who challenged me, who reminded me that life didn't end just because one chapter had closed. As the weeks turned into months, our connection deepened. It wasn't just the shared pain that brought us together, it was the way we understood each other on a level that didn't need words. Charlotte had a quiet strength about her, a resilience that inspired me to find my own. And slowly I began to heal. One evening, as we sat on the deck of my boat, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the stars, she turned to me and said something that caught me off guard. Do you ever think, she began, her voice soft, that maybe all of this happened for a reason? I frowned, unsure of what she meant. What do you mean? I mean, she said, gesturing between us, if Alice and Victor hadn't, would we have ever met? I didn't know how to answer. It was a question I hadn't dared to consider, and yet, sitting there with her, I couldn't deny the truth in her words. Maybe, I said finally, maybe some good can come out of all this mess. Charlotte smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. I'd like to think so. That night, as I walked her to her car, I realized just how much she had come to mean to me. She wasn't just someone who understood my pain, she was someone who made me want to move past it, who made me believe that life could be beautiful again, even after everything. Our relationship wasn't rushed. We took things slow, both of us cautious, both of us carrying the scars of betrayal. But with every passing day, I found myself letting go of the anger, the bitterness, the weight of what had been. Charlotte wasn't just a new chapter in my life. She was a reminder that no matter how broken you feel, there's always a chance to rebuild. After everything that happened, I realized I needed a purpose, a way to make sense of everything I'd been through. Sitting idle wasn't an option. Working on my boat or spending time with Charlotte filled my days, but there was a nagging feeling that I could do more. I wanted to give back, to channel the pain I'd experienced into something meaningful. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A friend of mine, Mark, whom I'd served with years ago, called out of the blue. He'd started working at a retreat center for men who were struggling with personal and emotional crises. When he heard about my divorce and everything that followed, he suggested I visit the center to see if it might be something I'd be interested in. It's not therapy, he explained over the phone. It's mentorship. You've been through the fire, Jack. Men need someone who can guide them through it. I was skeptical at first. The idea of talking about emotions and vulnerabilities with strangers felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. But Mark was persistent, and eventually, I agreed to check it out. The retreat center was located in a sprawling, wooded area just outside the city. When I arrived, I was struck by the tranquility of the place. It wasn't fancy, just a collection of rustic cabins, a communal lodge, and a small lake surrounded by trees. But there was a sense of peace there, a stillness that felt like a balm for the soul. Mark met me at the main lodge and gave me a tour, explaining the center's mission. They offered week-long retreats for men dealing with everything from divorce and loss to career burnout and identity crises. The focus was on creating a safe space for them to open up, share their struggles, and find a path forward. What we're really doing, Mark said, is helping them rediscover themselves. It's about rebuilding, one step at a time. I was introduced to the staff, a mix of counselors, coaches, and mentors like Mark, men who had their own stories of hardship and resilience. I spent the day observing, sitting in on group sessions and listening to the men share their stories. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt since retiring from the Air Force: purpose. By the end of the day, Mark made his pitch. "We could use someone like you, Jack," he said. "Someone who's lived through it and come out the other side." Think about it. I didn't need much time to think. A week later, I was back at the center, not as a visitor but as a mentor. The work was challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. My first retreat group consisted of 8 men, ranging in age from their early 30s to late 50s. They came from all walks of life: a teacher going through a messy divorce, a corporate executive burned out from years of overwork, a former athlete struggling with a loss of identity after retirement. Each of them carried their own burdens, their own scars, and it was my job to help them unpack those. I started with my story. I told them about my years in the Air Force, the sacrifices, the distance from Alice, and the betrayal that followed. I shared how it had broken me, how I'd felt lost and directionless, and how I'd slowly started to rebuild my life with the help of Charlotte and the people who had stood by me. It wasn't easy to lay it all out like that, but it set the tone. If I could be vulnerable, they could too. Over the course of the week, I watched as the men began to open up. There was Joe, the teacher, who broke down in tears as he talked about feeling like a failure as a husband and father. There was Kevin, the executive, who admitted he didn't even know who he was outside of his job. And there was Tom, the former athlete, who confessed that he felt like his best days were behind him and he didn't know how to move forward. I didn't have all the answers, but I listened. I asked questions. I shared what had worked for me, what hadn't, and I encouraged them to find their own paths. By the end of the retreat, something remarkable had happened. These men, who had arrived burdened and closed off, were laughing, connecting, and making plans for the future. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was a start. For the first time in years, I felt like I was making a difference. The work gave me a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't realized I was missing. It reminded me of my time in the Air Force, leading my team, guiding them through challenges. But this was different. This wasn't about strategy or tactics. It was about humanity, about helping people find their strength again. Charlotte was my biggest supporter. She loved hearing about the men I worked with and the progress they made. "You're doing something incredible," she said one evening as we sat on the porch of her apartment, sipping tea. "You're helping people heal, Jack. That's a gift." I smiled, her words warming something inside me. "Maybe, but I think they're helping me just as much." The retreat center became more than just a job. It became a second home. I started leading more retreats, each group bringing new challenges and new stories. And with every man I helped, I felt a little more whole myself. The pain of Alice's betrayal, the anger and bitterness that had once consumed me, began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, still days when the weight of the past crept back in. But I had found a way forward, a way to turn my pain into something meaningful. And for that, I was grateful.